Thank you all so much for coming. Grace and Ming and I are so excited to have you all here for the second meeting of the Classics Anti-Racism Reading Group. And we are lucky enough to be hosting guest speaker Shivaike Shah. I'm just going to give a short introduction, followed by Shivaike's talk, followed by the opportunity to ask questions. So yeah, Shivaike Shah is a British Indian producer who has worked in fashion, theatre, and film. He graduated in English literature from University College, Oxford in 2019. Shivaike was a catwalk producer at London Fashion Week and worked with a West End production company, Celador Worldwide. Shivaike is currently key assistant production coordinator on a large Netflix feature film. In March 2020, he founded Khameleon Productions. He's also the creator and host of the Khameleon Classics podcast, which we sent around with some of the emails on this event. So yeah, without further ado, I'm gonna pass it off to Shiv.
So yeah, Medea 2017, Francesca Almodovar-Rivers is the co-creator of Medea with me at Khameleon, currently on stage probably actually right now, or just leaving stage. She's in an adaptation of Antigone. So she's not able to be here today, but nor is she able to be with us in February because she's filming. She's a very busy actress, very difficult to get hold of. But she and I went to Oxford. I studied English, as Elizabeth said, and Fran was a musician, so neither of us are classicists. I've never studied classics, actually. She chose to put on a play. She wanted to put on a play with that society and with then what became Khameleon. And she chose Medea, which was admittedly quite the shock to all of us, both creatives. You know, she came to me as that's the play she wanted to produce. And the other play Fran and I had done that year was, you know, Debbie Tucker Green Random, which you probably don't know. That was a really sort of gritty, new writing, London play about a stabbing. It's a very sort of what you'd expect, what we all expected her to come out with when she was choosing the play for us. And she came with this ancient Greek play, and I'd never read it. I always say the first time I read the play, I didn't know the ending, which is remarkable. I had no idea she killed the kids at the end. Spoilers for everyone. But as we started to unpick it, with the team and figure out what we wanted to do with it, it became quite clear that the questions that we wanted to ask with the play and with the company at that point now, of home, belonging, identity, foreignness, broken promises, all these things that were so key for us as themes to explore with our artists and with our team, were really core in you know, Euripides' original. And we keep, I mean, it's a sort of quote unquote modern adaptation. In the Oxford production, we used the Robin Robertson adaptation, and we keep Medea in antiquity. So unlike, you know, the great Mahada, Lewis Alfaro or something, you know, we keep Medea in antiquity. Is an ancient Greek play. She's the triply exiled granddaughter of Helios, etc., etc. And what we do is we replace, to speak to those themes, right? We replace those Euripidean choralodes with modern spoken word pieces. So we commission new artists, poets, to bring themselves, their identities, cultures, sort of very rawly expose what they want to say in these spoken word pieces that replace those choralodes, and it brings the chorus, which is really the core part of what attracts us to this medium of theatre, is the chorus, to use them and those modern spoken word pieces to make space for really exploring those themes, but all within the context of the play. You know, those artists are all given the original choruses, the bits that they're filling in, right? And, you know, they know the play and they know what we're doing with it. So it becomes this hybrid play, very much in antiquity, but using these poems that speak to, you know, these modern day questions, or maybe they're not modern day questions. I mean, that's in itself a really interesting conversation with this play. She adapts those choruses then and makes them, you know, adapts them to song. And in the original show, they were all adapted from originally, you know, already existent songs. Now they're all new writing. And then she draws on those musical references. We all work with the artist and draw on those, you know, musical cultural references as well, to create this hybrid play of antiquity, the modern day, a normal theatre stage play with poetry and music. I mean, it all sounds rather intense. It is rather intense. But the result is, you know, an adaptation of Medea that uses the space of antiquity, this very old play, but you know, to platform all these land global majority artists, to platform these poems and Fran's compositions, etc., but to use this as a space then to explore these histories, to explore these diasporic stories and identities, to think about these questions of these individuals that we're working with, the stories that they want to share into a sort of collaborative space, right? We all work together to come up. If you think about it, if you count the poets as part of the script making process, which they are for their relevant parts of the script, there are 2 dramaturgs, me and Fran, and then 5 artists. That's a 9-person team to get that script together. It's a very, very collaborative process. To jump forward, I suppose we graduated Oxford in 2019. At that point in my career, just before the pandemic hit, February, I started to move from fashion into theatre. Great timing, as you can imagine. And that's when we decided to do the show again. And I was backstage on a shoot actually. And it was one of these, you know, diverse shoots, or so they say, and everyone in front of the camera was racialized as black or brown or whatever they wanted, and no one behind the camera was. And it was an absolute shit show of a production. I've never worked anywhere quite like that shoot. But when I saw the proofs that came through, I think it was the following evening we saw the proofs from the shoot. I knew that if I was looking at this in a magazine or saw it in Vogue or something, I would go, oh, great, what a great company, great shoot. Look at all of this diversity on camera and these great pieces of clothing that had these cultural references in them. And it was an absolute lie. And I called Fran that evening, and that was the day that we decided to refound the company and redo the show, because we realized that what we were doing behind the stage was still being lost. And I think we sort of naively went into London thinking we'd come out of Oxford, a very, very sort of restricted space, thought, wow, we're in London now and we'll all change. And we were wrong. We were very wrong. And so we started the show up, and we were thoroughly unemployed, as all artists were at the start of the pandemic. And weirdly, that left us with a lot of time to readapt the play, this time adapting the play ourselves, creating a quote unquote literal translation. I mean, what does that mean? I don't speak a word of Greek, but sitting with this book, which never leaves my bloody desk, the Mastronarde, Euripides, and every other commentary and adaptation you can imagine, from loads of different playwrights to loads of different literal translations, to come up with our blanket version of the text that we were going to use as the, you know, the text that we then built the script on. Now we're on script 9. And we had Rosa Andujar, who you may know the work of, King's College London Greek tragedy scholar. And then Avery Willis Hoffman at the time was a producer at the Park Avenue Armory in New York, but she was a classics PhD at Oxford years before. She studied under Fiona McIntosh and Oliver Taplin there, and she put on a version of Medea there actually. So then we had these 2 brilliant dramaturgs who were very much classicists and language specialists to help us through coming up with this translation. And then we recommissioned spoken word artists into our new script now. But as the pandemic very much was raging on, we realized that we weren't getting this on stage anytime soon. And we moved to the medium of film that, you know, Fran and I didn't know a huge amount about. But we moved to the medium of film, and a year later finally made our short film that will be obviously touring and premiering in the US. We didn't have any academic ties, which seems ironic now, as I, you know, hold a bunch of academic ties to a bunch of universities. At the time, there was really nothing academic about it. But as we started to unpick it and started to speak to more scholars, and had a few articles thrown our way and started to become a bit more educated on classics, which we really did know nothing about. We had an incredible conversation, for example, that Avery arranged with Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, the philosopher. We realized our sort of responsibility to address the field that we were stepping into and inadvertently stepping into, and the text that we were using and the legacy of that text, and what it meant to be working in the sort of classical, whatever that means, space. And from that was born the podcast series. Admittedly, that was originally 5, and I took it to the most ridiculous extreme, as I do with most things. And it then became this huge 35 episodes mammoth of a task to start unpicking, I mean, the field that we inadvertently sort of walked into, but then had a responsibility, I feel, to address our interaction with. And it was really, you know, that was a really key part of how we then started to build the show. And as the tour mapped out, as Brown offered us the residency as their artist in residence, and then all these other Ivies got interested, and then everyone was interested, and we mapped out this, you know, this 12-state, 34, 35, don't know how many schools we've booked now, this huge tour of the US, we started to become a lot more academically interested and started to realize sort of the wealth and complicated nature of the field that we'd become enwrapped in. But ultimately, we sort of are figuring out still how this old play, this very old play, is relevant to these modern questions, how we're working with these artists to make it relevant, and the ramifications of sitting, you know, with a play for a very long time now that sits within the, you know, Western canon, whatever that means, all the weight and complication that that term brings, to explore these core themes of Medea that really are the crux questions that Khameleon as a company is asking and will continue to ask with the film, with the podcast, with the staging of the play, through the tour. I mean, there's a lot of arms to our little endeavor, but really that's the core of what we're trying to do, and are constantly learning about doing, and will learn more and more about doing as we interact with, you know, hundreds of students across the country.
Yeah, just on that, I was wondering, you were talking a lot about some of the core questions of the Medea and like the core questions of classics. And I was just wondering if you could go into any more detail about like what you think some of like the most pressing questions of the Medea and classics are, and if there was anything like particularly surprising or notable you came across.
I think the thing I found most surprising was, first of all, the omnipresence of classics everywhere I looked. You know, I was getting fielded by random topic. You know, when I first heard classic with Tom Hawkins at Ohio, who's wonderful, and we're really excited to visit Ohio State. But when he first emailed me about classics in Haiti, I was like, okay, that seems like a bit of an irrelevant subject. I mean, where did that come from? And then I start reading the work he sent over, and, you know, it's a core thing to address. Barbara Goff with her Western colonial, you know, classics in Western colonialism in Africa. I was just a bit like, okay, but surely there are so many more relevant topics to talk about in Western. But then suddenly you find classics has such an omnipresence there. Or with them, the big one for me was when I found out, I've forgotten, Feroz Vasunia from UCL talking about Indian colonialism, and, you know, it's something I've read a lot about and have a lot of interest in, very much as an Indian whose family left India when Britain got slightly too involved. And it was remarkable for me to see how it had such a core impact on the civil service in a real way. You know, it wasn't something that was adjacent to how things happened. It was a cool thing. And I couldn't quite believe the naivety that we came to the subject with, in thinking that it wasn't, you know, didn't make that much difference. So I suppose the positive thing of those podcasts is realizing that, though the negative thing is realizing quite how unknown that is, even seemingly by people quite, you know, attached to and knowledgeable about the field. With Medea herself, I mean, then that question is purely artistic for me. I mean, looking at that character and what she does and how she does it is, it's just been a fascinating challenge for 4 years, and trying to put across, I mean, if you think about it simply, trying to make a play about a woman who murders her children is not an easy thing to do. And for us, ignoring the whole classical legacy of part of it, you know, I have to convince an audience member to sit down in a room and watch the descent of a mother willingly killing however many you have. I think in the text it's 2 boys, right? And however you do that, whether they're on stage or off stage, or whether it's suggested or done, or whether she comes out covered in blood or you don't see anything, whatever it is, that's still what you're prepping an audience to do. And getting her there and trying to find the reasons that she gets there. And, you know, to talk about it from an academic lens, if you think about that Dimitra Kasimis article, Medea as Refugee, which a fascinating article that really brings out the nuances of how much, you know, that status, or whatever that status could be, affects her. There are so many texts like that that really start, obviously for us, to help us think about her positioning and how she was, you know, what that character is, what her makeup was as she embarks on this crazy and cruel but eventually sort of jubilatory journey through this play. It necessarily brings out these questions and themes that we want to explore, because there's no way to get to the end of the play without having to question them for us. Because you have to provide a justification for a mother or a child sitting in the audience of why they're there watching it. And, you know, Medea lives on. People love this play. It's what the most adapted Greek tragedy of the last century. And there's something about it that just captures audiences. And it's for us just mining out what that is and how we're interacting with the themes that speak most to us, I think.
I wonder how you dealt with the issue of how to stage the ethnicity insofar as you define it of Medea herself, how you made a decision about that, and how you work with maybe some of the problems of the original in terms of yes, she's a foreigner and a refugee, and having her star as this murderer of her own children as some what do you do with that information? Do you an original Athenian audience might just want to play along and say, yeah, that's what these barbarians are like, or something like that. So how do you come up with something to do with that, given how explosive it is?
Our adaptation is from a racialized lens, right? For us, it's about that question.
Mm-hmm.
So the act of racializing Medea wasn't as much of a question as much as what that racialization does for the story, which sort of brings on to the second point. We knew Medea we knew that what we were doing with the text, with everyone on stage, is that they would be, racialized by their viewer in some way. They are sort of racialized bodies. Thinking about the ramifications of what that means, and also, with casting Medea specifically, thinking about how nuanced that needs to be with questions of colorism and questions of exactly whether we try to pace her identity, particularly, that's very difficult to do. But when it comes to the story, instead of viewing it as how she's going to be looked at, because we're approaching it sort of holistically from the idea of what does it mean to be a foreigner, right? It's from a different lens. It's not from the lens of looking at what she's doing. It's from the lens of working with her in what she's doing and trying to figure it out sort of from her perspective. And as you say, it's quite easy to be an onlooker, and we're going to try and encourage the audience, both with the way we creatively make the piece, by the fact that everyone is coming from this foreign angle, but also by the way that we present her as a character and the way that we break her down and her actions down, is trying to work with those themes and explore, what her version of home means and what those broken promises to her are, and what her identity as foreign. Not worrying so much about what the sort of metics of that mean in ancient Greece, but what her identity as someone who was triply exiled and did not belong in the space that she was in, what that does to her psyche, and try to encourage an audience to create a space where the audience views it from that perspective. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to convince an audience to take the side, and they're not necessarily having to take the side, but at least even take the perspective of a woman murdering her children in any compassionate way. But that's sort of the point, right? That's what we want to convince the audience to do.
Yeah,
we do that, of course, by bringing as much of that to the table as honestly and obviously as possible.
And the play itself, Euripides did that to the brains of his audience as well, pretty clearly. Is like made them think twice about the whole thing. I'm wondering too about Jason. What do you do there?
Yeah, this dynamic of him being the man who's marrying into this family to make his name for himself. And of course, it's probably not true to the original play, blah, 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 blah. But instead, I think it actually creates a real interesting opportunity to question another angle of something that I'm really interested in, of, if we think of Jason from that perspective, I think there's a lot of really pertinent questions of modern belonging and immigration that you can think about, of someone who wants to sort of marry in or make themselves belong to a community to which they don't feel. I mean, whatever Jason is in the original, he doesn't belong in Corinth, right? That's what he's trying to do by marrying in. He's trying to mark his space.
Yeah.
And if he's racialized in some way, actually, for me, it becomes a really interesting comment on, what my own parents did. There's a reason I sound like this. I'm a posh Brit. Why is that? Because it was so important to fit in and to make that transition. My parents were born in Southern Africa, but I was very much born here, right? How do we fix that? But also, if you take him at his word, which no one ever seems to, he says at some point in the play, I did this so my children would be the brothers and sisters of kings, right? Princes. And actually, if you view him as more of a multi-dimensional human being than the one-dimensional sort of foil that he so often is in adaptations. Medea, understandably, the play is all about her. She's on stage constantly. You always want to focus on her. But if you really try to give him some nuance and think about his perspective here and the potentiality that he is doing something, not just for his own material gain, but he has his own agenda that could matter to him with his own children and his own idea of how he wants to fit in and his own idea of what belonging to Corinth could mean, should mean not only for him, but his future generations of children.
He's in exile himself, so he's trying to make his way in. He's got this weird, there's a sort of cruelty to his rationality too. It's just so you can talk about Medea making self-serving arguments, but Jason, my goodness.
he is brutal, but he's very clear. I mean, he's got a very, very set agenda, whether you agree with it or not. I don't think people agree with Medea's agenda, right? It's difficult to really agree with what anyone is doing in this play. But it's when you get sort of sucked into the nexus of it all, it just constantly creates these spaces for asking these questions of how far you're willing to go and how far people do go. And I think that part of the reason why the play survives so much is that people can just constantly see reflections of potentialities, even when they're questioning their own belonging, the own way they act. I think it's all there. It's just there to an extreme. Presenting their actions as rather than sort of two opposing things, but potentially two sides of the same coin of looking at what belonging could mean to different people, I think gives Jason a lot more nuance than he's often granted in. And also, you know, recognizing his position as different, both as a male, as someone who has sort of more to prove than she does. You know, he's quite weak, to be honest, in many ways. And so trying to figure that all out is really, it's tough. Our Medea, certainly the way I view Medea, she very much knows that he's there because of her. And that's, you know, as much as she's angry because he's leaving her, she's sort of angry because of that sheer spite to just, you know, I got you exactly where you are. And I think that responsibility, you know, my mother would very much say it was her responsibility. That responsibility is one that is so often overlooked, but also one that brings with it such a unique dynamic. It's such a tough dynamic to, maybe she explains it herself. She would rather, what does she say? You know, she would rather go to war 3 times and face the pangs of childbirth once. I mean, she's pretty clear about what she's able to do, very good at doing, and what she found really tough. And trying to bring that relationship out on stage, again, without it just being a yelling match, which is so easy to do. And anytime you rehearse that scene, when I tell you that those actors just start yelling, they get angry at each other. And they're married. I mean, it's arguing, you know, broken up married couple. It's just space to sort of yell. But in there are so many really interesting power dynamics, as you've just explained, right? So many, and you don't have that much of the past. In the play, it moves so quickly, you don't really learn that much about what they were. And if, you know, got an audience member that knows nothing about Jason, you have to try express all of that, because he just gives, you know, that nurse little scene at the beginning going, blah, 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 here's the story where you are, and then boom, 2 people are dead, and then 2 kids are dead. I mean, so quick. There's no space to tell it. There's no exposition in this play. It just goes, and then it's like a snowball, and it just avalanches, and you can't stop it when it starts. And it's for a director, I'm sure it feels like you never have any control over the play, because as soon as that, and as soon as it sort of loses momentum or moves too quickly, and we had it in our performances in Oxford, as soon as it gets moving, the train's left the station, you can't stop it. You just have to do whatever you can to try and, you know, ensure that actors have some steam for the end. And Medea's on stage all the time as well. I mean, she gives monologue after monologue. There's only the opening scene was without her. But in all of that, you have to try and explain those backstories, but they're not that important, right? They don't need to know what Jason actually did, but they need to try and get that and over. And that's why we really try to focus on those relationships and how those relationships are brought across and how the intentions are brought across. Because frankly, Euripides doesn't give you any time to do anything else. It doesn't give you time to give any background. And seeing as we're filling, you know, half the play with choruses and spoken word pieces, I mean, there really is no time. We've chosen this different way to do it, and because you can't give any exposition, all of it will come down on explaining his intention and exploring that relationship, because it's the only thing you have time to do on stage.
Yeah, just on the idea of Medea's monologues, I think something that always strikes me in this play is Medea's taking on certain masculine qualities or like rejecting her femininity. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, what you had done with Medea's feminine identity in your staging of
I
it.
think I want to revert to the Casimus article here, actually, because something that she says completely blew my mind, which is that she sort of, yeah, it's very easy to say that she relinquishes her female identity, and there are so many adaptations that, you know, the killing of the children is the moment where she's no longer mother. Frankly, I think that's very boring. I think it's very obvious, and I certainly don't think that gives any credit to Medea. And something the Casimus article blew my mind with is she says, you know, the way that she convinces, you know, the way that she secures her escape is through promising children. She does the only thing, you know, the thing that only women can do. She says, I'm going to secure you children. She does it in this weird proxy way of her magic or whatever. But, you know, she gets out by reinstating her claim to motherhood in some way. That's how she secures her exit at the end of the play. When I remember reading that and the way she talks about that, and the way that she talks about how, you know, the only reason she got that 24 hours is because of her womanhood, and she performed that womanhood to Creon to ensure that she gets that 24 hours. Actually, I just don't think it's as simple as her having some descent from womanhood into masculinity, or descent from womanhood into some sort of agendered monster. I really don't think that's the case. I actually think that it's a really interesting and complicated exploration of what performances of the performances of femininity are, and how Medea has to perform them and operate within those structures, because that's the only real power she has over these men is through her children, whether that be her actual children, the children that she promises to Aegeus, the promise of her motherhood to Creon, and saying that I need to secure, you know, my role as mother to these children, so you give me that 24 hours, in which she kills them. I mean, everything is actually constantly centered around her, but then she has to constantly center herself around that, you know, performativity of what they want her womanhood to be, if you like, to do anything. The play only works because she has those opportunities. And I think it's easy and lazy to view the text as just Medea relinquishing some motherhood, or relinquishing her femininity. I don't think that's what she's doing at all. And I think she's far more aware of her role and how that role balances her out to all the men surrounding her. There's only men on stage, right? And how she has to perform that role to get anywhere. And she does, and she will continue to do it after the play ends. You know, she will secure more children for the person who sort of gave her that. I mean, that weird, sick twist ultimately means that she never gets out of that bond to motherhood. It may not be her children, but it's still always based on at least that aspect of her womanhood. So it's impossible, I think, to tie her out of that in any way. And I think it's lazy to do so.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. And we're just so grateful that you shared all of this with us, and we're excited for your February visit.
Lovely to meet you all, and I hope to meet all of you in person in February, if we are so lucky as to be able to come and COVID goes away for long enough for us to make it to the US.